So when the sound came, not a knock, not exactly, but the flat, desperate impact of two fists hitting wood with everything behind them, Ethan did not move right away. He sat in the chair beside the dying fire and listened. Because the first thing a man alone for 15 years learns is that the wilderness makes sounds that fool you. Wind, ice, a branch giving way under snow. He had learned not to trust his ears. But then it came again. And this time, there was a voice with it. "Open this door." The words hit him like thrown stones. "Open this door, or I will die on your porch and you will have to live with that." Ethan was on his feet before the sentence finished. He crossed the room in 4 steps, grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall beside the door, and stood there for exactly 2 seconds with his hand on the latch. Not from fear, but from the habit of 15 years that said, you don't open a door in the middle of a blizzard at midnight without knowing what's on the other side. Then he heard it. A sound underneath the voice. Underneath the words and the fury and the cold. Something that wasn't anger at all. It was pain. He threw the latch and opened the door. The woman standing on his porch was enormous. That was the first thing, not cruel, not unkind, just the first undeniable fact of her. She was tall and broad, and her belly was pushed out in front of her like she was carrying a whole future inside, which Ethan supposed she was. Her coat, a man's coat, too large, dark wool, was soaked through with snow and hanging open because it could not close across her middle. Her boots were destroyed, the leather split at both sides. Her hair was frozen dark strands plastered to her face. Her hands gripping the doorframe on both sides were cracked and bleeding from the cold. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Brown, dark as creek water in October, and looking at him with something he had not seen in so long that it took him a moment to name it. Not fear, not begging, defiance. "Well," she said through teeth that were chattering so hard he could hear them, "are you going to make me stand out here until I have this baby in your doorway, or are you going to let me in?" Ethan stepped back. He wasn't even sure he made the decision. His body just did it. She came through the door sideways, one hand still gripping the frame, and he saw that she was limping badly on her left side. As soon as she was past the threshold, she stopped and stood there in the middle of his floor, dripping snow, not looking at anything. Just breathing. Like a person who has been holding themselves together with pure will for a very long time and has now just barely allowed herself to stop. He closed the door behind her and threw the bolt. "Sit down," he said. "I'm not sure I can." She said it matter-of-factly, not asking for sympathy. "My hip went about 2 miles back. If I sit, I'm not certain I'll get up again." "Then stand," he said. "But get closer to the fire." She moved toward it. Slowly. Each step deliberate. He watched her and said nothing. Because whatever was happening here, rushing, it seemed like exactly the wrong instinct. When she reached the fireplace, she stood with her back to him, face toward the flames, and put her hands out toward the heat. Her knuckles were bad, split open in 2 places, the blood dried black and rust-colored on her skin. "How far did you walk?" he asked. "Far enough." "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She turned then just slightly so he could see the side of her face. "I came from the Decatur Ridge, down through the East Pass." Ethan stared at her. "That's 7 miles," he said, "in this storm, at night." He looked at her belly, at the way she was standing, at the way one hand had dropped to rest against her side, just under the swell of her abdomen. "How far along are you?" 8 months. She paused. "Maybe a little more." "Maybe a little more," he repeated. "I didn't exactly have a doctor keeping count," she said, and there was something dry and sharp in her voice. Not bitterness, he realized. Humor, fierce, exhausted, nearly buried under everything else but there. He crossed to the fire himself and used the iron to stir the coals, then laid 2 more logs across them. The flames jumped up immediately. He could see her better now, the fullness of her face, the shadows under her eyes that spoke of days without sleep, the way her jaw was set like something carved. "You need to sit," he said again, quieter this time. There's a chair right there. It's not elegant, but it holds. She looked at the chair. Then she looked at him. If I tell you something, she said, I need you to not throw me back out into that storm before I'm finished. Ethan watched her for a moment. I'm not going to throw a pregnant woman into a blizzard, he said. You might, she said, when you hear what I'm carrying. And she wasn't talking about the child. He moved the chair closer to her and waited. She sat down heavily with a long, slow exhale that was almost a groan, her hand pressed to her lower back. For a moment, she just closed her eyes. Then she opened them and looked at him directly with those dark eyes that didn't flinch. My name is Clara Bennett, she said. My husband was Daniel Bennett. He worked for the Caldwell Cattle Company out of Cheyenne, accountant, bookkeeper, records man. He was very good at his job. She stopped. They killed him 8 weeks ago. Made it look like a riding accident. Ethan was still standing. He hadn't moved. Who killed him? He said. It wasn't a question exactly. Edmund Caldwell, she said, and 2 men who work for Senator Hargrove out of the Wyoming Territorial Government. She said the names the way someone says something they've rehearsed 1,000 times, the names they've held in their mouth like stones they were afraid to swallow. My husband found out what they were doing to the land, the seizures, the forged titles. There are families, immigrant families, homesteaders, people who broke their backs on that soil who've been losing everything for 3 years. Daniel found the records that proved it. All of it. Every transaction, every forged document, every payment. She reached into the coat. Her hand went deep inside, past the lining, and came out holding a bundle of papers wrapped in oilskin, the edges soft from being carried against a body for a long time. He copied everything before they got to him. Ethan looked at the bundle, then at her. And you walked 7 miles through a blizzard at 8 months along, he said slowly, carrying those. I walked 7 miles through a blizzard at 8 months along, she agreed, because the men who killed my husband found out the copies existed. They've been 3 days behind me. She paused. I think tonight they might be closer than that. The fire popped. Outside, the wind screamed across the roof. Ethan turned and walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. He couldn't see anything beyond the snow sheets of white cutting sideways through the night. But that didn't mean nothing was there. How many? He said. At least 3 that I know of. He turned back to her. Clara Bennett was sitting in his chair, soaked through a little bloody enormous with child, and watching him with an expression that had gone very still and very clear, as if she had already decided that whatever happened next was outside her control, and she had made her peace with it. I'm not asking you to fight for me, she said. I'm not asking you for anything you're not willing to give, but I needed shelter, and I needed warmth, and I needed to be off that mountain before... She stopped. Her hand pressed harder against her side. Before I couldn't be any more. He came back to the fire. He stood there for a long moment looking at her, looking at the papers in her lap, looking at the way she was holding herself spine straight despite everything, chin up, despite everything, as if the mountain hadn't beaten her at all. My name is Ethan Calloway, he said finally. I've lived alone in this cabin for 15 years. I do not have company. I do not want company. I had a wife once and a daughter once, and both of them are gone, and I have been trying very hard not to care about anything since then. He picked up the rifle and leaned it against the fireplace where both of them could reach it. So understand that I'm not doing this because I'm a good man. I'm doing it because I am not the kind of man who sends a pregnant woman back into a storm. Clara looked at him for a long moment. What kind of man are you? She asked. I'm not sure anymore, he said honestly. Go ahead and dry out. I'll check the barricades. He moved toward the back of the cabin and she watched him go. Then she looked down at the papers in her hands, looked at the fire, looked at the door he'd bolted behind her. She hadn't told him the worst of it yet, but there would be time. Maybe. He came back from checking the shutters on the rear windows and found her still in the chair. But she had her coat open now, and her hand was flat against her belly, in that particular way that told him the baby was moving. Face he couldn't quite name. Something private and fierce and heartbreaking all at once. "When did you eat last?" he said. "Yesterday morning." He went to the shelf without another word and took down the bread and the dried beef and the jar of preserved peaches that he'd been saving for no reason in particular, and he brought them all to her and set them on the small table beside the chair. She looked at them, then at him. "Thank you," she said, quietly, like the words cost her something. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Eat." She ate. He watched her, not watching him watch her, and he began to move around the cabin, doing the things that needed doing, checking the bolt on the front door, pulling the heavy chest in front of the rear entrance, taking stock of the ammunition on the shelf. 14 shots. Not a generous number if things went badly, but better than none. "You know how to use a rifle?" he asked her. She looked up from the bread. "My father taught me to shoot before he taught me to read," she said. "Good." He set one of the rifles on the table beside the food. "That one's yours." Clara looked at it, set down the bread, picked up the rifle, checked the load with hands that were quick and certain, and completely unself-conscious, then set it across her knees. Ethan found himself watching her for a moment longer than made sense. 15 years had built a wall inside him. He knew that. He'd built it intentionally, brick by deliberate brick. Because the alternative caring feeling, being the kind of man who could lose something, had turned out to be unbearable. He had decided after the fever took his wife and daughter in the same terrible winter, that the safest thing was to become something that didn't need anything. A stone. A closed door. He had been fairly successful. And now there was a woman in his chair. Not a small woman. Not a fragile woman. A woman who had walked 7 miles through a Montana blizzard with killers behind her and a dead man's evidence sewn against her chest, and who had arrived at his door and demanded shelter without a single word of self-pity. A woman who accepted a rifle the way most women accepted a cup of tea as something practical and necessary and entirely unremarkable. He had not expected to find her remarkable. He was finding her remarkable. "Stop looking at me like that," she said without looking up from the fire. "Like what?" he said. "Like you're trying to figure out what I am," she said. "I'm a widow. I'm going to be a mother. I'm trying to keep alive long enough for this baby to be born somewhere that isn't a snowdrift." She finally looked at him. "That's all. There's no mystery to figure out." "Your husband," Ethan said carefully. "What was he like?" Something crossed her face. Something real and unguarded. "Gentle," she said. "The kind of gentle that gets mistaken for weakness by people who don't know the difference." She was quiet for a moment. "He was afraid the night he came home with those copies. Terrified. His hands were shaking. But he did it anyway." Her hand went back to her belly. "He knew what it might cost. He did it anyway." "He was trying to protect those families," Ethan said. "He was trying to do what was right," she said, "which is a more stubborn thing than trying to protect someone. It doesn't stop when things get dangerous." She looked at him again. "I think you might understand that." He wasn't sure he did, not anymore, but he didn't say so. "There's a room in the back," he said instead. "It's not much, but it's warm and the roof doesn't leak. You should try to rest." "I can't rest," she said. "Clara." "They're coming," she said simply calmly, as if she were stating the weather. "I don't know if it's tonight or before dawn or with the morning, but they are coming, Mr. Calloway. I have been 3 steps ahead of them for 9 days, and I don't have another 3 steps in me. Tonight we make our stand here, or I didn't survive this far for anything." Ethan stood very still. Outside, something shifted in the storm. He couldn't have explained it not in words, but something changed in the sound of the wind. Something that had nothing to do with weather. He crossed to the window in 2 fast steps, put his back against the wall, and looked out from the edge of the glass into the darkness. Clara was on her feet behind him before he could tell her to stay down, rifle in hand, moving more quietly than a woman 8 months along had any business moving. "You said 3, he said low, not turning from the window. "At least," she said from right behind his left shoulder. I see 2 horses, he said. East side of the tree line. There'll be a third, she said, coming around. He turned and looked at her, then just for a second, just to see what he was working with. Her face was white with cold and exhaustion and pain that she was swallowing down moment by moment. There was a bruise along her jaw he hadn't noticed before. Her breath was coming a little too fast, and he knew from the way her other hand kept drifting back to her side that it wasn't only fear. Something else was happening. Something the baby was doing. Something her body was doing that she was refusing to acknowledge out loud. Are you all right? He said quietly. I will be, she said. After. It was not a lie exactly, but it was not the whole truth either. Stay back from the windows, he said. I'll stay where I'm useful, she said. And she moved not behind him, but beside him, and took up a position against the opposite side of the window rifle, up and easy in her hands, eyes fixed on the tree line. Ethan Calloway had not fought beside another person in 15 years. He had not stood next to someone and felt the particular human warmth of a body near his own, the sense of a second heartbeat in the room, in longer than he could remember. It hit him strangely like cold water, like light through a shutter crack, something that was almost pain, but wasn't. Outside in the snow, one of the horses moved. A shadow separated from the tree line and began moving toward the cabin. Ethan put his cheek against the stock of his rifle. Beside him, Clara Bennett did the same. And the storm came down around them like a living thing, and the fire burned low behind them, and the papers with their dead man's truth lay on the table between the bread and the preserved peaches, and whatever was coming through the snow came on. Clara's hand found the trigger guard, with the certainty of a woman who had made her decision a long time ago. She had carried her husband's child through 9 days of running and a mountain of snow and a night that wanted to kill her. She had not come this far to stop now. The shadow in the snow raised one arm, and everything that happened next would change both their lives beyond anything either of them could have guessed standing there in that fire-lit cabin at the edge of a Montana winter, 2 broken and stubborn people with rifles in their hands, and a whole terrible night still ahead of them. The shadow stopped. It raised both hands slowly, palms out, and stepped into the light that bled through the cabin window. A man. Old coat. No rifle raised. His horse was behind him, and his hands were very deliberately empty. Calloway. The voice came through the storm like a rock thrown at glass. Ethan Calloway. I know you're in there. I got no quarrel with you. Ethan didn't move from the window. That's Gideon Marsh, Clara said low and tight beside him. He was there the night they killed Daniel. I saw him. He's not the one who pulled the trigger, but he's not innocent either. What does he want? He wants me to believe he's reasonable, she said. He always wants everyone to believe he's reasonable. That's how he works. Ethan cupped his hand around the side of his face and looked through the glass. Marsh was still standing there with his hands up, snow driving sideways across him. Calloway. The woman inside is carrying something that doesn't belong to her. You hand her over with no trouble, and we walk away. You got my word. His word, Clara said, and the 2 words were flat and sharp and without a trace of softness. How many more past the tree line? Ethan asked. At least 2. Maybe a man on foot coming around the south side. Ethan pulled back from the window. His mind was already moving, not in panic, but in that old cold way he remembered from years ago before the grief had slowed everything down. 14 shots. 2 exits. 1 injured woman beside him who was more competent than she had any right to be, and who was also 8 months along and had walked 7 miles through a blizzard and was refusing to acknowledge that her body was doing something alarming every few minutes that had nothing to do with bullets. Calloway, Marsh again. I'm going to count to 30. That's a fair count. You're a reasonable man. He keeps saying that word, Ethan said. Reasonable, Clara said. It means he's already decided what happens if you aren't. Ethan turned to her. There's a floor door under the rug beside the stove. Goes down to a root cellar. You take those papers and you get down there. She looked at him. No, she said. Clara, I have 14 rounds in this rifle, and I can see the window, she said. You need me up here. You're 8 months. Don't, she said, and the word was very quiet and very final. Don't finish that sentence the way I think you're going to finish it. I have been 8 months along for the past 9 days of running. I will be 8 months along for the next however many hours this takes. My condition is not a reason to put me in a cellar. He stared at her. She stared back. Outside, Gideon Marsh was still counting. 15, Marsh called. 16. Fine, Ethan said. The south window. If someone comes around, I'll see them, she said, already moving. He didn't stop her. He turned back to his own position and called out through the door, his voice flat and carrying. Marsh, I don't know what you think you're doing on my land in the middle of the night, but the next man who moves toward this cabin takes a bullet. I don't care who gave you your word to give. Silence from outside. Just the wind. Then Marsh's voice came back, and the reasonableness had gone out of it entirely. You're making a mistake, Calloway. I've made plenty, Ethan called back. One more won't surprise me. He heard Clara from the south side of the cabin. Someone's in the barn. Everything happened at once. The front window exploded inward. Ethan dropped below the sill and came up on the other side as a figure tried to climb through young Manhat, pulled low rifle swinging, and Ethan grabbed the rifle barrel and used the man's own momentum to send him back through the window and onto the porch hard enough to end the conversation. From the south side, Clara fired once, then again. Ethan crossed the room in 4 steps. Are you hit? No. She was pressed against the wall beside the south window, rifle still raised. He pulled back, went behind the barn. Where's Marsh? Still at the tree line. He's letting the young ones go first. Her voice was entirely steady. Her hands were entirely steady. But Ethan could see the way she was standing. Her weight shifted hard to the right, her left hand pressed low against her side in between moving the rifle. She'd done it 3 times now. Each time she thought he wasn't watching. Clara! Don't, she said again. How far apart? He said. She was quiet for just a moment too long. It doesn't matter, she said. It matters a great deal, he said. She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were very dark and very direct, and completely unafraid, and that was the thing about her. He was realizing it wasn't that she didn't know how frightened she should be. She knew exactly. She'd simply looked at it and decided it wasn't going to be the thing that stopped her. 12 minutes, she said. Maybe 10 now. Ethan breathed in slowly. The contractions, he said, have been coming since about an hour before I reached your door, she said. I was hoping they were false. They're not. She looked at him steadily. But they're not close enough yet to stop me from doing what needs to be done in this room. So let's do what needs to be done. He wanted to say something. He wasn't sure what. Something that would address the sheer impossibility of the situation. 3 armed men outside, a woman in labor beside him, 14 rounds on the shelf, a Montana blizzard welding the world shut. What he said was, all right. And she nodded once, like that was exactly what she needed to hear. From outside, the barn door crashed open. Ethan spun to the east window and saw it, orange light blooming through the gap. Someone had lit something inside. Hay, most likely. Dry fast and extremely persuasive. They're smoking us out, Clara said. Or trying to burn the barn and blame it for the cabin catching, Ethan said. Force us out into the open. He looked at the front door, looked at her. There's a pump behind the cabin. Water barrel might still be Ethan. She said his name for the first time, and the sound of it hit him somewhere he'd thought was walled off. The barn is already gone. They know it. They want us outside. She paused. Don't give them what they want. He turned back to her. The papers, he said. If they get inside, they won't get inside, she said, and the calm in her voice was extraordinary and maddening. You don't know. I know I didn't walk 7 miles through a blizzard to hand those papers to Gideon Marsh. Her voice cracked just slightly at the end, not with fear, with effort. Because the next contraction hit her then, and he watched her take it, jaw tight, Breath controlled one hand on the wall for exactly 3 seconds before she straightened again and raised the rifle. "I'm all right," she said before he could speak. "Clara." "They're moving," she said. He heard it too. Footsteps on the porch. 2 sets, coming from different angles. What happened in the next 90 seconds was something Ethan Calloway would turn over in his mind for the rest of his life. Not the violence of it, not the sound, but the image of the woman beside him. Moving through the cabin with that rifle like she knew exactly where her body was in space, like the weight and the pain and the exhaustion were simply facts she had already accounted for. She covered the east side while he covered the door. When the handle moved, she called it before he could. When the shadow crossed the south window, she tracked it without a word from him. They held the cabin. When it was quiet again, and the immediate threat had pulled back to the tree line, Ethan stood in the center of the room and felt the silence settle back around them, changed different from before. Heavier, more real. "You've done this before," he said. "No," she said. "Then how?" "Because I don't have the option of not knowing how." She set the rifle carefully on the table and pressed both hands against her lower back. "Daniel used to say I was stubborn enough to argue with gravity." Her breath caught slightly, released. "I prefer to think I'm just practical." Ethan watched her. "Sit down," he said, and this time it was not a request. She sat. He went to the shelf and brought water and the last of the cloth he used for dressings clean enough, and he came back and crouched in front of her and looked at her hands, because he needed something specific to do some concrete task, because the alternative was to stand here and feel the full weight of what this woman had just done in his cabin beside him, and he wasn't ready for the size of that feeling yet. Her hands were worse than he'd thought. The cold had cracked the skin across 3 knuckles on the right, and she hadn't said a word about it through any of it. "This is going to sting," he said. "I'm currently having contractions," she said. "Your definition of sting and mine have diverged somewhat." He almost smiled. He caught it before it got all the way. "The papers," he said, working carefully. "We need to get them somewhere they can do what your husband intended. There's a telegraph office in Millhaven, 20 miles east." 20 miles in a blizzard," she said. "When this storm breaks." "And Marsh and his men." 3 became 2, he said. "Maybe less." She was quiet for a moment, watching his hands on hers. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd point me back down the mountain," she said simply. "Most men would have." He didn't look up from her hands. "Most men haven't spent 15 years regretting every door they didn't open." It was more than he'd meant to say. She didn't push it. She just let it sit there in the warm air between them, neither of them looking at the other. The fire beginning to rebuild itself behind them. The storm still savage outside, but the cabin itself holding. Then she said very quietly, "He left a letter. Daniel, with the papers." She glanced toward the oilskin bundle on the table. "I haven't been able to read it. I've been carrying it for 9 days and I haven't been able to open it." Ethan looked up at her then. Her face was composed. Everything about her was composed, but her eyes had gone somewhere else for just a moment, somewhere small and private and full of grief that she hadn't had 9 days to sit down with yet. "You don't have to," he said. "I know." She brought herself back. He could see her do it the exact moment she pulled the grief back in and closed the door on it, the way a person does when there isn't time. "Not tonight." Another contraction moved through her. He saw it in the set of her jaw, in the way her hands tightened briefly under his. 7 minutes this time, maybe less. He sat back on his heels and looked at her directly. "Clara, I need you to be straight with me." "I have been entirely straight with you," she said through her teeth. "How close?" She looked at him. The composure held for another 2 seconds. Then she said with the first real exhaustion he'd heard from her, "Closer than I would like." He stood. He went to the back room and pulled the blankets from the narrow cot, all 3 of them. He brought them back. He moved the chair so it faced the fire more directly, and he checked the water he'd put on to boil earlier, out of some instinct he hadn't examined yet, and then he turned around and said, You're going to tell me what you need. I've delivered calves before, she said, and he couldn't tell if it was a joke or not. And this time there was nothing dry or sharp in it. Just a woman being honest. I've known for 2 days. I was trying to make it to Millhaven. You're not making it to Millhaven tonight. No, she agreed. I'm not. Outside, the wind shifted, and from somewhere past the tree line, past the burned remains of the barn, past the darkness and the snow, and the 2 men still out there with their orders and their guns, came the sound of a horse moving. Not toward the cabin this time, away from it. Ethan went to the window, looked out. One of them's riding out, he said. Clara's voice came from behind him, slower, now more careful. To get more men, she said. Or to telegraph ahead and cut off the road to Millhaven. A pause. Or both. He turned. She was still in the chair, still upright, still holding herself with that bone-deep stubbornness that he was beginning to understand was simply the way she was built, not performed, not chosen in the moment, just the bedrock of her. But her color had changed, and her hands resting flat on her knees had finally stopped pretending. Mr. Calloway, she said with immense dignity, I believe we are about to have a different kind of problem than the one outside. He crossed the room. Ethan, he said. She looked at him. My name is Ethan, he said. If we're going to do this, you should probably use it. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile, and not quite tears, and was, he thought, one of the most human things he had ever seen in his life. All right, she said. Ethan. She breathed through another wave, and when she came out the other side, her voice was level, and her eyes were clear, and she looked at him like she was handing him something she had never handed anyone. I need you to not panic, she said. I won't, he said, and I need you to understand that I have done the most terrifying thing I have ever done in my life getting to this door tonight, she said. And I have one more terrifying thing left to do, and I intend to do it the same way I've done everything else. I know, he said. I just need you beside me, she said. The fire was steady. The water was hot. The storm pressed against every wall of the cabin and didn't get in. And Ethan Calloway, who had spent 15 years learning how not to need anything, pulled the chair closer and sat down and stayed. The first hour was the hardest thing Ethan had ever witnessed in his life. Not because Clara screamed. She didn't scream. That was the thing. She breathed through each wave with her teeth together, and her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, and her hands gripping the arms of the chair until her knuckles went white. And when it passed, she would release a long, slow breath and look at him and say something completely ordinary. How's the water? Or, did you hear anything outside? Or once in the deep valley between 2 contractions. Daniel wanted to name him Joseph, after his father. Did you? Ethan asked. I wanted to call him something that sounded like he could take care of himself, she said. Something strong. She paused. I hadn't decided yet. You've got a little time still, he said. She almost smiled. Less than you'd think. And then another wave hit her, and the almost smile disappeared, and he watched her go somewhere internal, that he had no access to some place where she was completely alone with whatever her body was doing. And he sat there with his hands ready and his heart doing something complicated in his chest that he hadn't given it permission to do. Outside, the wind had dropped by maybe a quarter. Still fierce. Still dangerous. But quieter than it had been, which meant sounds carried differently now, which was how he heard it. Hoofbeats. Coming back toward the cabin. Not 1 horse. 3. The man who rode out hadn't gone to telegraph anyone. He'd gone to get reinforcements. Ethan was at the window in 2 steps. How many? Clara said from behind him, and her voice was breathless, but her attention was entirely present. 3 coming in, he said. 1 already behind the south tree line from before. That's 4 total. He turned. I need you on the floor, Clara. I'm in labor, she said. The floor is where I was already headed. I mean now, he said. Before they get within range. She was already moving. Not fast. She couldn't be fast, but deliberate, and without wasted motion, sliding from the chair to her knees, and then onto the blanket he'd laid down earlier, and he saw the pain move through her when she did it. But she didn't make a sound, just pressed one hand flat to the floor and breathed through it. He checked the rifle. Checked the revolver on the shelf. 11 shots remaining, and whatever was in the cylinder 6. 17 total for 4 men who had ridden through a blizzard and were not going to be in a mood for conversation. The knock on the door when it came was not Gideon Marsh this time. The voice was younger, harder, no patience left in it at all. "Calloway, last chance. Open the door and step out. Bring the woman and the papers. Nobody has to get hurt." "Somebody already got hurt," Ethan called back. A pause. "Your choice," the voice said. Then something hit the side of the cabin, a sound like a great hand slamming the wall from outside, and for one terrible second, Ethan thought it was a battering ram. But then he smelled its sharp chemical, not wood, not snow, and he understood. They'd brought lamp oil. He could hear it running down the outside wall, hear it dripping from the sill of the east window. "Ethan!" Clara's voice from the floor, low and controlled. "I know," he said. "If they light it, I know." He went to the east window and put his back against the wall and thought hard and fast the way he hadn't thought in 15 years, because there had been nothing worth thinking hard and fast about. 3 men outside the door. 1 at the south end. 4 points of entry. 2 people inside, one of whom was currently on the floor in active labor, and the other of whom was him 51 years old and out of practice, but not as it turned out entirely without instinct. He went to the chest he'd pushed against the back entrance. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. "Creating a problem for them," he said. He moved the chest, cracked the back door 2 inches. The wind hit him like a flat hand to the face. He could see the south side of the property. The man there had moved closer while the others held the front. Too close. Close enough. The shot he fired through the 2-inch gap was not elegant, but it was effective. The man on the south side went down hard and stayed down. The response from the front was immediate. 2 shots that came through the front window and buried themselves in the far wall. Ethan dropped flat-rolled, came up behind the overturned table he'd set on its side earlier for exactly this reason. "They know you're not going to wait," Clara said. "Good," he said. "I don't want them comfortable." From outside, a new sound. Something small and purposeful, a flint striking. And then, heat not from inside, but crawling up the east wall of the cabin, finding the oil-soaked wood, and moving through it with the fast, hungry certainty of fire that knows exactly what it wants. The east wall began to burn. Smoke came first. Always smoke first. It moved low and fast across the ceiling, and Clara on the floor pressed her face lower and pulled the edge of the blanket up over her nose. Ethan grabbed the water bucket from beside the stove, already warm from sitting near the fire, and threw it at the base of the east wall, and knew even as he did it that it wasn't going to be enough. Water and oil don't agree. The fire climbed higher. "The papers," Clara said, "already handled." He'd moved the oilskin bundle inside his own coat 20 minutes ago without telling her. Some decisions were faster made than discussed. She looked at him when she understood. Something moved across her face. "Ethan." "Later," he said. Another contraction took her then, and this one was different from the others. He could see it in the way her whole body changed, in how her breath stopped entirely for 3 full seconds before she could find it again. And when she looked at him afterward, her eyes were very clear and very immediate, and she said simply, "It's time." Inside a burning cabin with 3 armed men outside, of course it was time. "Tell me what you need," he said, and he was already moving to her. "Just don't leave me," she said. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. What happened in the next stretch of time had a quality that Ethan could never afterward describe, properly compressed and enormous all at once the way certain hours are. The fire on the east wall found its way to the ceiling, and the smoke thickened, and he kept low, and kept close, and kept talking to her. Not helpful talk. Not instructions. Just the sound of his voice, because she'd asked him to stay, and staying meant more than just his body in the room. She worked without complaint. She worked without surrender. She worked with every ounce of a woman who had decided 9 days ago that she was going to see this through, and who had not changed that decision once, despite every reasonable opportunity she'd been given to collapse. He heard the front door take a hit. The bolt held. Another hit. The frame cracked. "Ethan," she said, urgent and breathless. "Almost," he said. "Keep going. You're almost there." "Not me." She reached out and grabbed his arm. "The door." He understood instantly. He grabbed the rifle from beside him, swung around and fired twice through the door as the third blow came. The sounds from outside changed. 2 men. One down, one retreating. He could hear the boots on the porch pulling back. Smoke was everywhere now. "Clara." He turned back to her. "Clara, look at me." She looked at him. Her face was soaked with effort, and her breath was all wrong, and her eyes had a brightness in them that was beyond pain. Something on the other side of pain that he'd only ever seen once before in the face of a woman he'd lost. "You can do this," he said. "I know that," she said with tremendous dignity. "I've always known that." And then, in the burning cabin, with smoke against the ceiling, and men outside, and a storm against the walls, Clara Bennett did the thing she'd been carrying herself toward for 9 days and 600 miles, and 1 marriage, and 1 murder, and 1 frozen mountain. The baby came. And the baby was silent. Not the silence of sleep. Not the silence of simply being new and overwhelmed. The wrong silence. The silence that takes hold of a room and changes the temperature of everything in it. Clara heard it. He knew she heard it because her whole body went rigid, not with another contraction, but with something far colder. She lifted her head and looked at Ethan, and she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The question was entirely in her eyes. He looked at what he was holding. The child was small, too still, blue-white around the mouth. A boy. Daniel's boy, Joseph, or something strong, or something that sounded like it could take care of itself, and right now he was none of those things. He was terrifyingly quiet in Ethan's hands. "Ethan," Clara said. Her voice had broken open. He didn't answer her. He did what he'd once watched a midwife do in a different life. A life with a different cabin and a different family, and a child of his own who had come into the world fighting. He worked fast and certain, and without letting himself feel the fear that was trying to get its hands around his throat. He cleared the airway. He rubbed the small back with both thumbs. He bent down and breathed carefully, just barely, just enough, and waited. "Ethan?" Clara's voice was barely sound. "Please." He breathed again. He pressed 2 fingers to the tiny chest. He breathed again. From outside, the remaining man hit the door one more time, and the bolt finally gave, and the door swung open on cold air and firelight. And Gideon Marsh stood in the doorway with a revolver already raised, and his eyes moving fast across the room. He saw Ethan on the floor with the infant. He saw Clara. He saw the rifle lying beside her on the blanket. His gun swung toward Ethan. Clara Bennett, who had walked 7 miles through a blizzard at 8 months along, who had fought through a night of smoke and contractions and gunfire, and every possible reason to stop Clara Bennett, picked up that rifle. She was flat on her back. She had nothing left. She picked up the rifle, and she put 1 shot through the firelight, and Gideon Marsh went down in the doorway and did not get up. The echo of the shot faded. Smoke moved through the open door, and then small and furious and entirely unmistakable came the cry. The baby cried. It was not a strong cry. It was thin and wavering and enormous. It was the most important sound Ethan Calloway had heard in 15 years. His hands shook for the first time all night. He pressed the child against his chest and felt the tiny heartbeat going hard and fast and real under his palm, and his eyes burned, and he told himself it was the smoke. "Give him to me." Clara's voice, wrecked and reaching, He placed the baby against her chest. She put both arms around the child and held on with the particular ferocity of a woman who has carried something through impossible weather and has no intention of ever letting it go again. She was shaking. Or he was. Or the whole cabin was the east wall cracking and groaning as the fire moved through it. But she held the child, and the child cried, and the sound of it, thin and new and unstoppable, was louder than everything else. "He's alive," she said, not to Ethan, to herself, to Daniel, to anyone listening. "He's alive." Ethan sat on the floor beside her in the smoke and the firelight and felt 15 years of closed doors all straining on their hinges at once. He had told himself he was not a good man. He wasn't sure that had ever been true. "We have to move," he said when he could speak. "The wall isn't going to hold much longer." "I know," she said. "Can you?" "Yes," she said, before the question was finished. He looked at her, at the child, at the absolute certain ruin of the east wall, and the smoke banking against the ceiling, and the open door where Marsh lay still. "There's a trading post," he said. 6 miles. Maybe a little more." "Miles," she said with something that might have been a laugh in different circumstances. "You said you could stand," he said. "I said yes," she said. "I'll worry about the rest when I'm upright." He got his arm under hers and helped her up, and she made no sound at all, which was more impressive than anything else she'd done in the last several hours, and that was saying something extraordinary. She held the baby against her chest with one arm, and he wrapped the blanket around them both, and she looked at him and said, "The papers." He patted his coat. She nodded once. They went to the door. The storm was still out there, still cold, still the kind of wind that tells you exactly how small a person is against the size of the world. But the snow had eased just slightly, not enough to call it kind, but enough. Clara looked at the darkness and the cold and 6 miles of Montana winter standing between her and the first safe place she'd been in 9 days, and she stepped through the door without hesitating. Ethan stepped through behind her. The cabin burned at their backs, and the baby bundled against his mother's chest in the cold made a sound that was small and indignant and perfectly alive, and Clara walked into the dark with her head up and her arms full of everything she had left to protect. Ethan walked beside her and did not let her fall. The cold hit them like a wall the moment they cleared the porch. Not the cold of discomfort or inconvenience, the kind of cold that Montana reserves for January nights when it means business. The kind that finds every gap in every layer and begins its work immediately and without apology. Ethan felt it across his face and hands. Clara felt it and said nothing, only tucked the baby tighter against her chest and kept walking. The first 100 yards were the worst, not because of the distance, but because of what Clara's body had just done, and was now being asked to do the sheer biological impossibility of a woman an hour past childbirth, putting one foot in front of the other through 6 inches of snow in the pitch dark. Every step was a negotiation. He could see it in the way she moved slower than before, more deliberate. Her weight shifted slightly forward over the baby. Her jaw set in that particular way he'd come to recognize as her version of screaming. "Tell me if you need to stop," he said. "Keep walking," she said. "Clara. The baby needs warmth, and I need a doctor, and neither of those things are behind us." She didn't look at him. "Keep walking." He kept walking. They found a rhythm after a while, not fast, not graceful, but steady, in the way that matters most when the alternative is stopping. He stayed at her left side with his arm ready. She didn't take it. But she didn't tell him to move away either. The trail east from his cabin was one he'd walked 1,000 times over 15 years. He knew every turn of it, every place where the ground dropped away or the tree cover thinned. He guided her through the worst of it by touch and memory, one hand on her arm, when the footing changed a word, when a drift had built up across the path. They were maybe a mile out when the baby stopped making sounds, not in the wrong way, not in the way that had stopped Ethan's heart inside the cabin. Just the deep quiet of a newborn that has exhausted itself with the effort of arriving. But Clara felt it immediately, that change in the small body against her chest, and she stopped walking. "He's breathing," Ethan said, before she could ask. "Ready. Sleeping. He's warm." She stood there for 3 full seconds with her eyes closed. "All right," she said. Then she opened her eyes and started walking again. They were 2 miles out when Ethan heard it. A sound behind them. Not wind, not a branch. The particular crunch of something large moving through snow at a pace it was trying to keep quiet. He didn't say anything to Clara. He just moved slightly, putting himself between her and the sound, and reached for the revolver at his hip. "I hear it," she said quietly. "Keep moving," he said. Same pace. "How far back?" "100 yards, maybe less." "1 man or 2? He listened. "1 horse, 1 rider." Clara's hand slipped inside the blanket she'd wrapped around herself and the baby. He knew without looking that she was reaching for the small pistol he'd pressed into her coat pocket. Before they left the cabin, the one from the shelf loaded, that he hadn't mentioned until the moment he handed it to her, and she'd taken it without comment, like a woman who expected the world to require that of her. "If they wanted to shoot us, they'd have done it already," he said. "Unless they want the papers back first," she said. He stopped walking, turned around, raised the revolver. "Come out from the trees," he called into the dark. A pause. Then the sound of hooves slowing. Then a voice young and cracked with cold, and very specifically not the voice of a man who wanted trouble. "Don't shoot! I ain't armed. I swear to God I ain't armed, mister." Ethan kept the revolver up. "Who are you?" "My name's Tommy Reese. I rode out with Marsh's men tonight." A pause. "I didn't know what I was riding into, I swear. They told me it was a simple job. Collecting property." Another pause, smaller. "I didn't know there was a woman." "There's always a woman," Clara said from beside Ethan, dry as dust. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I got 2 horses. I thought I heard you walking, and I thought maybe—" The voice stumbled over itself. "I got 2 horses, and I ain't going back to Marsh, and I thought maybe you needed one." Ethan and Clara looked at each other in the dark. "How old are you?" Ethan said. 19, the voice said. Then quieter. "Almost." Clara put her hand on Ethan's arm. One brief pressure. He lowered the revolver. "Come out slow," Ethan said. "Both hands where I can see them." The boy who emerged from the trees was exactly as young as he'd sounded, narrow-shouldered, shaking with cold, his hat pulled down, and his hands absolutely empty and raised at shoulder height. He was leading 2 horses by their reins. His eyes went to Clara and the bundle against her chest, and something moved across his face that was genuine and unguarded. "Is that a baby?" he said. "No," Clara said. "It's a very small adult." The boy stared at her. "Yes," Ethan said. "It's a baby, born tonight, in my cabin, which is now on fire." He watched the boy take that in. "You said you've got 2 horses." "Yes, sir." "The lady gets one. You lead the other and walk beside me where I can see you." He held the boy's eyes. "You do anything I don't expect, and I will not be understanding about it. You hear me?" "Yes, sir," the boy said with enormous relief. Getting Clara onto the horse was not a simple thing. She managed it without asking for help, and with a sound that she pressed her lips together to contain, and when she was settled with the baby secured against her chest, she sat absolutely straight and looked ahead, and did not mention whatever that had cost her. They moved faster after that. Ethan walked. The boy Tommy walked beside him, leading the second horse, not speaking unless spoken to, which Ethan respected more than he would have expected to. About a mile from the trading post, Ethan's boot found the place where the trail edged close to the drop-off on the north side. He'd known it was coming. He'd navigated it 1,000 times in daylight, in the dark and exhaustion, in the aftermath of a night that had stripped something from him and replaced it with something he didn't have a name for, yet he misjudged it by 2 inches. His left ankle went sideways off the edge of the trail. He heard it before he felt it, a sharp, wet sound that meant something structural. Then the feeling came up through his leg like fire, and he went down on one knee in the snow, with his teeth together and his hand on the revolver out of pure reflex. "Ethan," Clara's voice from above him from the horse. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not fine," she said. "Tommy, stop." Tommy. He got his hand on his horse's stirrup and pulled himself upright. The ankle screamed. He put weight on it carefully. It held barely with the wrong quality of give underneath it that told him it would not hold indefinitely. "We're a mile out," he said. "I know we're a mile out," Clara said. She dismounted before he could tell her not to. She was on the ground in 2 seconds, baby still against her chest, and she was at his side before he could form a sentence. "Clara, get back on the horse." "Put your arm over my shoulder," she said. "You just gave birth." "Ethan!" She looked at him with those dark eyes in the dark, and her voice was completely calm and completely final. "Put your arm over my shoulder and walk." He looked at her. She looked back. He put his arm over her shoulder. They walked. He would think about that mile for a long time afterward. The weight of his arm across a woman who had no more right to be standing than she had to be flying, and who bore it without complaint and without slowing, and without once suggesting he could rest. The baby between them, small and warm, sleeping against the cold. Tommy leading the horses behind them and having the wisdom not to speak. The trading post appeared through the last of the trees as a lit window, amber and steady, and the most beautiful thing Ethan had seen since the baby cried. He felt Clara's breath change when she saw it. Just slightly. Just for a moment. And then she straightened even further and kept walking because that was simply the kind of woman she was. The man who opened the trading post door was named Garrett Fossey, and he had run that post for 22 years and believed himself unshockable. He was wrong. He looked at Clara, enormous and blood-stained and frost-covered with a newborn against her chest. Then at Ethan, limping against her shoulder, then at the teenage boy behind them, and he said absolutely nothing for a full 4 seconds. Then he said, "Get in here, all of you, now." His wife, a small, fierce woman named Ruth, had Clara settled and wrapped, and the baby properly bundled before Ethan had finished getting through the door. Ruth's hands moved with the certainty of a woman who had seen hard things and knew how to meet them practically, and she asked no questions until Clara was warm, and even then, she only asked what mattered. "The baby came tonight," she said. "About 2 hours ago," Clara said. "Early. A little." Ruth looked the child over with the same practical certainty, and then said, "He's small, but he's strong. Hear him breathing. That's a strong sound." She looked at Clara directly. "You both need a doctor." "Tomorrow," Clara said. "Tonight I need the telegraph." Ruth looked at her. "The telegraph." "Please," Clara said. It was the first time Ethan had heard her say that word. Garrett Fossey had a telegraph line, the only one within 40 miles, installed 3 years back at considerable expense and considerable pride. He led Ethan to it while Ruth stayed with Clara, and Ethan reached inside his coat and laid the oilskin bundle on the counter and opened it. The papers were dry. Every one of them. Everything Daniel Bennett had died for perfectly preserved. Garrett looked at them. Looked at Ethan. "Who do these go to?" he said. Ethan thought of what Clara had told him in the cabin, in what felt now like another lifetime. Another world before fire and birth, and 6 miles of frozen dark. "The Denver Post," she had said, "and the Kansas City Star. Daniel had contacts at both. He made me memorize the names." She had given him those names in the cabin while the water boiled, and she'd said them with such precision, such deliberate care, that he'd understood she'd been rehearsing them in her mind for 9 days like a prayer. He gave Garrett the names. Then he sat beside the telegraph, and he began reading aloud what was written on those papers. Not all of it, but enough. The key numbers. The forged titles. The payments. The names attached to the payments, including a senator's name, that made Garrett Fossey stop what he was doing and look at Ethan with an expression that had gone very still. "You sure about this?" Garrett said. "I'm sure," Ethan said. "Send it." The telegraph worked for the next 40 minutes without stopping. When it was done, Garrett sat back and looked at the pile of papers and let out a long breath. "Son," he said, though Ethan was older than him by 10 years. Do you know what you just started? Something that should have been started a long time ago, Ethan said. He went back to the room where Clara was. She was sitting upright. She was always sitting upright with the baby asleep in her arms and Ruth's blanket around her shoulders and her face the color of old wax. But her eyes were clear and immediate, and the first thing she said was, "Did it go through?" Every word he said. Something happened in her face then. Not collapse. Clara Bennett did not collapse, but a release. A letting go of something she had been holding with both hands for 9 days through 600 miles. And one murder, and one mountain, and one burning cabin, and one impossible night. And now she could put it down because the thing Daniel had died for was out in the world and could not be taken back. Her eyes filled. She didn't cry. Not all the way. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the baby, and she said very quietly, "Do you hear that, Joseph? Your daddy did it? He did it." Joseph. So she had decided. Ethan stood in the doorway and felt something shift inside him. Something that had been locked for 15 years, solid and immovable, finding for the first time in a very long time the smallest possible crack of light. Ruth came and stood beside him and looked at Clara and the baby and said quietly, "She's going to need at least 2 weeks before she should move anywhere." "She can stay here," Garrett said from behind them, appearing with coffee. "We've got the room. It ain't grand, but it's warm and it's safe." Ethan looked at Clara. She hadn't heard them, or if she had, she was too deep in the private world of new mother and new child to surface from it yet. "She'll argue," Ethan said. "Let her argue," Ruth said. "I've got 4 children and a husband who thought he could milk a bull once. I can handle argument." Ethan almost smiled. Got there this time. He took the coffee Garrett offered and sat down on the bench by the door and stretched his ankle out carefully. It throbbed with a low, insistent heat that he knew from experience meant 3 to 4 weeks of limited use. He looked at it without sentiment. Then he looked at Clara. She had closed her eyes finally. The baby was against her chest, rising and falling. Her hand was curved around the back of the small head, with that particular completeness of a person holding the only thing in the world that matters. Tommy appeared at the far side of the room, hovering with the uncertainty of a 19-year-old who had ridden into something well above his experience level and was now not sure if he was in trouble or not. "Boy," Ethan said. Tommy snapped to attention. "Sit down," Ethan said. "Drink something warm. You did all right tonight." Tommy sat. The trading post was quiet, except for the fire and the wind outside and the small sounds of a sleeping infant. And then, from the bench against the far wall, Clara Bennett opened her eyes and looked at Ethan, and said with the directness that he was learning was simply how she moved through the world, "You need to tell me about your wife." He looked at her. "Not tonight," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not tonight." She closed her eyes again. "But soon." Outside, the storm began slowly, almost reluctantly, to ease. The wind dropped another degree. The snow thinned. Somewhere far to the east, beyond mountains and telegraph wires and the names of powerful men about to have a very difficult morning, a newspaper editor was reading words that Daniel Bennett had died to write. And in a small trading post in the Montana mountains, a woman who had been called too heavy and too slow and too much by people who had never seen what she was capable of, held her living son and breathed. And Ethan Calloway, who had not felt the future as anything other than empty space for 15 years, sat beside her in the warmth and found that the empty space had changed its shape entirely. The first morning was gray and still and smelled of pine smoke and coffee, and the particular quiet that follows a storm that has finally spent itself. Ethan woke on the bench where he'd fallen asleep, sitting upright, his ankle stiff and swollen inside his boot, and the first thing he did before he opened his eyes fully was listen. Old habit. 15 years of being the only person in a space had made him an expert at reading silence, the quality of it, what it contained, what it meant. What it meant this morning was different from any morning he could recently remember. It meant a baby breathing. He opened his eyes. Clara was asleep in the chair across the room, genuinely asleep, Not the watchful half-rest she'd managed in his cabin, but deeply and completely under her head, tipped slightly to one side, Joseph against her chest, rising and falling in that small, urgent rhythm of new life. Ruth had tucked a blanket around them both, sometimes in the night. The fire was steady. Outside, for the first time in days, there was no wind. He sat there for a long time and did not move. He was not sure what he was feeling. It had the quality of something large that hadn't finished arriving yet, like weather you can smell before it reaches you. 15 years of closed doors and deliberate silence, and now this. A woman asleep in a chair, a living child. His own hands that had done something the night before that he hadn't known he still had in him. He got up carefully so as not to wake them and went to find Garrett. The scandal broke before noon. Garrett had a copy of the first telegram response by mid-morning, the Denver Post editor writing back in language that even through telegraph compression managed to convey barely contained excitement. By afternoon, there was a second response, Kansas City, asking for confirmation of the senator's name and whether the signatory, Daniel Bennett listed on all the copied documents, could be contacted for verification. Garrett looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the response. "I'll tell her," he said. Clara was awake when he came back to the room. Joseph was nursing or trying to, and Ruth was coaching her through it with the blunt, practical warmth of a woman who had done this before and considered embarrassment an unhelpful luxury. Clara looked up when Ethan came in and read his face immediately, the way she'd been reading things immediately from the first moment he'd opened his door. "It's out," she said. "It's out," he said. "Both papers. They're asking for confirmation. They're asking for you." Something moved across her face, a wave of something enormous that she held with both hands, chin up, jaw set. And when it passed, she looked down at Joseph and said very quietly, "Your daddy's name is going to be in every newspaper from here to Washington. You remember that." The baby made a sound that had nothing to do with newspapers, but was extremely sincere. Clara looked up at Ethan with red eyes that hadn't spilled over and said, "I need you to help me write what to send back." "I know," he said. "We'll do it together." They spent 2 hours on that telegraph response. Clara dictated, and Ethan wrote, and then she read what he wrote and changed words here and there with the precision of a woman who understood that how a thing is said determines whether it can be dismissed. She named names. She gave dates. She described in plain language what Edmund Caldwell and Senator Hargrove had done to those immigrant families and struggling homesteaders. And she named Daniel Bennett as her husband and the original source of every document, and she signed it herself. Clara Bennett, widow, Montana Territory. When Garrett sent it, the room was very quiet. Then Tommy, who had been hovering in doorways for most of the morning with the expression of someone who isn't sure if they're forgiven, yet said, "Ma'am, will they actually do something about it? The newspapers." Clara looked at him. "They will," she said. "Because the people who've been losing their land are real people with real names, and those names are in those documents, and a newspaper can make real people real to 10,000 readers overnight." She paused. Daniel understood that. It's why they killed him before he could mail anything. She looked back at Joseph. They were too late. Tommy nodded slowly. "What are you going to do?" Ethan asked him. "After." The boy looked at his hands. "I don't rightly know, sir. I can't go back to Caldwell's operation. I don't have much else." "You can work," Ethan said. Tommy looked up. "I had a barn," Ethan said. "I'm going to need a new one." He held the boy's eyes. "You willing to work for honest wages?" "Yes, sir," Tommy said immediately and with enormous feeling. Clara watched this exchange and said nothing. But Ethan caught the look on her face when he glanced over something warm and dry and aware, as if she was noting something she'd already suspected about him and was now confirmed. "Don't look at me like that," he said. "Like what?" she said. "Like you figured something out." "I figured several things out," she said pleasantly. "I'm being polite about not listing them." Ruth laughed from this corner. The first real laugh in the room, and the sound of it broke something open in the air, and even Ethan's mouth pulled sideways against his will. The days at the trading post moved differently than any days Ethan had lived in recent memory. He was used to the same hours, the same silence, the same four walls, each one indistinguishable from the last. These days had weight and texture. They had Joseph in them, who woke at irregular intervals and announced his presence to the entire building with complete confidence. They had Clara in them, who argued with Ruth about when she was allowed to stand up and won approximately half those arguments. They had Ruth's cooking and Garrett's running commentary on the telegraph responses that kept arriving more each day as the story spread from Denver and Kansas City to papers further east, then further still. By the end of the first week, a territorial marshal arrived. Young Ernest, slightly overwhelmed by what he'd ridden into. He sat across from Clara with his hat in his hands and his notebook open, and she told him everything. Calmly, precisely, in order, without embellishment. The names, the dates, the documents, the night they killed Daniel, the 9 days after the cabin, all of it. The marshal wrote without stopping for 90 minutes. When she finished, he looked at his notes and then at her and said, "Ma'am, I have to ask, how did you carry all this for 9 days, alone in your condition?" Clara looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. "My condition," she said, "is that I am a woman who decided her husband's death was going to mean something. That's not a particularly unusual condition." She paused. "And I wasn't entirely alone at the end." She looked at Ethan when she said it. He looked back. The marshal left with a copy of every document and the names of every man involved, and enough to bring the full weight of territorial law down on Caldwell's operation, and everything connected to it. 2 weeks later, Edmund Caldwell was arrested in Cheyenne. Senator Hargrove resigned before they could arrest him, which everyone agreed was not the same as justice, but was at least a beginning. 3 of the families who had lost land had their cases reopened by the end of February. Daniel Bennett's name appeared in 7 newspapers. Clara read every one of them. She read them aloud to Joseph, who was too young to understand, and seemed to find the sound of her voice more interesting than its content, which she said was perfectly all right, because he had his whole life to learn the details. Ethan was there for most of the readings. He told himself he stayed because his ankle needed another week before he could manage the walk back to what remained of his property, which was true. He told himself after the ankle healed that he stayed because Tommy needed supervising on the initial clearing of the burned structure, which was also true. He told himself, after that was done, that he stayed because Garrett needed help with resupply before the next stretch of winter, which was marginally true and considerably convenient. Clara watched him find these reasons and said nothing, with the eloquence of a woman who does not need to say the thing that is already understood. It was on a Tuesday in the 3rd week, in the quietest hour of the afternoon, when Joseph had gone down for his longest sleep, and Ruth was busy, and Garrett was in the store, and the whole trading post had settled into that particular afternoon stillness, that Ethan sat down across from Clara at the small table and said, "Her name was Margaret. My daughter was Eleanor. She was 4. Clara set down what she was holding. She looked at him and said nothing, because she understood that this was not a thing that needed prompting. It needed space. "Fever came through the winter of '69, he said. "Fast. The way those things are, sometimes there one day, done with you the next." He looked at the table. "I was away when it started. I'd gone for supplies, 3 days. By the time I got back, Eleanor was already gone. Margaret lasted another day." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't there. Ethan, I've spent 15 years making sure I was never in a position to not be there for something that mattered," he said, "by making sure nothing mattered." He looked up at her. "That's the whole of it. That's the man you knocked on the door of." Clara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You were there when it counted." "One night. You breathed life into my son," she said, "with your own hands, in a burning cabin." Her voice was even and her eyes were direct, and she was not offering comfort. Exactly, she was offering fact, which was somehow more. "You stayed beside me when you had every reason not to. You carried those papers 6 miles through a Montana blizzard on a broken ankle, and you never once made me feel like a burden." She paused. "That is not the behavior of a man who doesn't know how to be there." He had no answer for that. Joseph made a small sound from across the room, not waking, just shifting some private dream moving through him, and both of them looked over instinctively, the way people do when a small life is in the room and everything in them is tuned to its frequency. Ethan got up and went to the crib Ruth had produced from somewhere in the back of the trading post. He looked down at the baby. Joseph had his mother's coloring and his father's hands, or so Clara said, and Ethan had no way to verify it, but he believed her. He was 3 weeks old, and already seemed to be approaching the world with a certain considered intentionality, as if he was noting things and filing them away. "He looks like he's planning something," Ethan said. "He gets that from his mother," Clara said from behind him. "I know," he said. He heard her stand. He heard her cross the room. She came and stood beside him, and they both looked down at Joseph, and the moment had the quality of something that is also a question, neither of them speaking, it both of them knowing it was there. "I have nowhere to go," Clara said finally, not with self-pity, just as information. "Daniel's family is in Ohio, but we weren't close. The house we were renting in Wyoming isn't mine. I have the papers Daniel left me, his letter, and Joseph." She paused. "And whatever I can build from here." "The letter," Ethan said. "You read it." "Last week," she said. "Alone, in the middle of the night." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask because some things belong to a person entirely, and the only right response to them is to leave them that way. But she said, "He told me to find somewhere safe. He said—" She stopped, cleared her throat. "He said I had a gift for making places into homes, and he didn't want me to stop doing that just because he wasn't there to see it." Ethan looked at the baby. "My land is about 12 acres, he said. East-facing. Good soil under the rock. Water from the creek runs clear 10 months of the year. The cabin site is flat, and the burn cleared away a lot of what needed clearing anyway." He stopped. "Tommy's already started on the framing for the new barn. He's better at it than he looks." Clara was very still beside him. "The new cabin," Ethan said, "could be larger than the old one. Doesn't have to be just one room." The silence stretched. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "I'm stating a set of facts," he said. "What you do with them is your business." She turned her head and looked at him. He looked back. And whatever passed between them in that moment, two people standing over a sleeping infant in a trading post in Montana, in the deep cold of winter. It was not a small thing. It was not a simple thing. It had the weight of two lives that had each been broken in different ways, and had each kept moving anyway, which is not the same as being unbroken, but is arguably more interesting. "I would need my own room," she said. "I know that. And Joseph would need a nursery," he said. "I know. And I will not be told what I can and cannot do based on my size or my circumstances or any other thing that is none of anyone's business." "I wouldn't dream of it," he said. "I've already seen what happens when someone tries." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at Joseph. "All right," she said, quietly. The way she'd said it that first night when he'd told her to eat, and she had, and everything had begun. "All right." Spring came, the way spring comes to Montana slowly, and then suddenly snow giving way to mud, giving way to the first thin green along the creek bank. Tommy turned out to be an excellent carpenter when properly motivated and properly paid, and the new cabin went up in 6 weeks on the same patch of earth as the old one, bigger in every direction, with a proper window on the east side that caught the morning light and 2 rooms in the back, and a rocking chair on the porch that Garrett had traded them for 3 months of Ethan's labor, which Ethan considered the best trade he'd made in years. Clara planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the cabin. She did it herself, which surprised nobody who had spent more than 20 minutes in her company. She was out there with Joseph in a sling against her chest, digging with a purpose that made